The restaurant pulsed with quiet elegance. Crystal glasses reflected golden light from chandeliers, polished cutlery gleamed against white linen, and the murmur of wealth floated between the tables. For the guests, it was another ordinary evening of fine dining. For her, it was another night of being invisible. She moved silently through the crowded floor, carrying trays with steady hands. The black vest hugged her frame, the white shirt pressed perfectly, the apron tied with care. She knew every corner of the dining room, every flicker of candlelight, every impatient sigh from clients who barely noticed her face. She was a shadow gliding between tables, acknowledged only when drinks were late or plates too cold. No one asked her name. No one wondered what she thought when she bowed slightly to pour wine or set down a plate of steaming food. To them, she was a pair of hands, nothing more. But beneath her quiet eyes, there lived a mind that saw everything. The laughter that masked arrogance, the whispered arguments behind forced smiles, the way money wrapped the room in false importance. She had worked there for months, long enough to understand her role, to serve, to smile, to vanish. And she had mastered it. Yet, in the still moments, between one table and the next, she felt the weight of her invisibility pressing down like a cloak she could never remove. Tonight was busier than usual. The maitre d' walked faster, the head chef barked sharper orders, and even the waiters who usually mocked her behind trays moved with tense precision. She overheard whispers. A billionaire was coming. The kind of client who made the restaurant's reputation, who filled every employee with fear and the possibility of a tip that could pay a month's rent. But the billionaire would not be alone. He would bring his mother. Balancing a tray of crystal glasses, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For a moment, she studied herself. The stiff collar, the neat hair tied back, the eyes that revealed nothing. To the world, she was no one. But at home, she practiced sign language in the mirror, words shaped in silence that no one here knew. She had no reason to think about it now, no reason to connect those gestures to the evening ahead. Still, a thought flickered in her chest, faint but restless. Something would change tonight, but what she didn't know was that this would be the last evening she ever walked through that dining room unnoticed. The night moved forward with mechanical rhythm. Orders flowed from the kitchen, plates moved to tables, and she moved with them, like a gear in a machine too large to ever notice its smallest part. Routine was her shield. It protected her from stares that judged, from words that dismissed, from the loneliness that echoed even in a crowded dining room. She carried herself with practiced discipline, back straight, steps measured, voice almost never used. A polite smile curved her lips when required, but it was not real. It was survival. Beyond the silence she endured each night, there was another silence she chose. Alone in her small apartment, she had studied the deliberate motions of her hands in front of a mirror. She had learned sign language, not because she needed it for work, but because it gave her a sense of connection to something larger. If the world refused to hear her voice, her hands could still speak. She never told anyone. To them, she was just the quiet waitress. That secret was hers alone, a hidden strength waiting, though she had no idea when or if she would ever use it. She refilled glasses and cleared plates. Businessmen laughed too loud. Couples whispered over wine. Everyone lived inside their own world, untouched by those who served them. Invisible again. But tonight felt different. The maitre d' checked the door more often, straightening his tie nervously. The chef shouted louder than usual. Whispers passed like sparks. He's coming, the billionaire, and his mother. Her hand tightened around a tray. Mother. Something about that word held her still. She shook the thought away. Guests came and went every night. This was no different. At least, that's what she tried to believe. But somewhere deep inside, she knew. This night would break her routine in ways she could not imagine. By 8 o'clock, the restaurant had transformed from a place of quiet elegance into a stage trembling with anticipation. The chandeliers glowed brighter, polished glassware shimmered like jewels, and every waiter moved as if performing a well-rehearsed ballet. But beneath the surface of order, tension simmered. The maitre d's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Check the wine temperature. Align the chairs. No fingerprints on the cutlery, please." His usually calm expression was replaced by anxious precision. Even the pianist, who played softly in the corner, seemed to sense that tonight wasn't ordinary. The waitress adjusted her apron, smoothing the fabric with trembling fingers. She had endured endless nights of serving the wealthy, men who measured worth in currency and women who spoke only through the weight of their jewelry. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just busyness. It was pressure, the kind that made every mistake feel fatal. Whispers circulated between the staff like electricity. "They say he's bringing his mother, the billionaire." "Yes, the one who owns half the city." Another waiter lowered his voice. "They say he tips in silence, and fires in silence too." The waitress said nothing. She didn't feed on rumors, she fed on instinct. And something about tonight made her pulse quicken. The kitchen roared behind her. The head chef barked commands. Knives clattered, flames hissed. "We cook for power tonight," he shouted. "There's no room for failure." Even he, proud and untouchable, looked through the small service window to check the dining room, a trace of nerves hidden behind authority. The waitress moved through the tables with her usual grace, checking details guests would never notice: folded napkins, spotless glasses, steady candles. It was her way of staying invisible. But inside, her thoughts churned. She wondered what kind of man this billionaire was, what kind of mother raised him, and why the mention of that word, mother, felt like an echo in her chest. She caught her reflection in the polished metal of a wine bucket. For a second, she barely recognized herself, the tired eyes, the calm posture that hid exhaustion. She inhaled deeply, steadying her breath. "Just another night," she whispered. But she didn't believe it. At 8:55, the maitre d' lined up the staff by the entrance. "Remember your stations," he hissed, "and smile, always smile." The restaurant fell into a rehearsed stillness. Candles flickered, soft music swelled, and the air turned heavy with the perfume of anticipation. Every employee stood alert, their nerves disguised behind practiced elegance. The waitress positioned herself near the far end of the room, where she could see everything but remain unseen. Her pulse matched the rhythm of the music, slow, tense, deliberate. And then the maitre d' lifted his hand. The signal. The heavy double doors began to open, and she knew whatever entered next would change her life forever. The double doors swung open, and the entire restaurant changed. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks halted above plates. The pianist missed a note, then stopped completely. A silence so deep it almost had a sound rippled through the room. He appeared first. The billionaire. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a calm authority that didn't need noise. His black suit fit like it had been tailored by hands afraid to disappoint him. Every step echoed on the marble, steady and slow, a rhythm that bent the air around him. He didn't look left or right. He didn't need to. The room already revolved around him. The maitre d', suddenly pale, rushed forward and bowed so deeply that his voice cracked when he spoke. "Welcome, sir." His words trembled. The billionaire gave only a curt nod, his expression unreadable, his control absolute. And then, behind him, came the woman who silenced even the whispers. His mother. Her hair was silver, gathered into a graceful bun. A navy silk gown shimmered softly in the chandelier's light. Her face held a quiet dignity, but her eyes moved differently. They followed lips, not voices. They searched expressions instead of sound. The waitress noticed instantly. Her trained eyes, so used to reading moods to avoid conflict, saw the truth in seconds. The older woman lived in silence, not isolation by choice, but by circumstance. And yet there was peace in her expression, the kind that comes from strength earned over years. The billionaire placed a careful hand on his mother's arm, guiding her toward the grand table in the center of the dining room. His touch was protective, but also controlled, too careful, as if even affection had to obey his rules. Guests leaned forward, whispering, "She's deaf, isn't she? She looks so elegant." They say he adores her. From the kitchen, the chef peeked through the serving hatch, motioning for silence. Even his team of cooks stood frozen, pots steaming behind them. The maître d' rushed to pull out the chair at the central table, the one reserved for only the most important guests. The billionaire nodded slightly, seating his mother. Her gown flowed like water as she sat, her back straight, her presence commanding without a single sound. The billionaire adjusted her napkin, spoke softly, his lips moving carefully. She smiled, nodding politely, though her eyes showed only partial understanding. It was clear. Her world was silent, and his world never slowed down enough to meet hers. The waitress, standing near the back, felt a strange pull. Something in her chest tightened. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Because in that quiet woman's solitude, she saw herself. The mother's gaze drifted across the room, catching the waitress's face for a fleeting second. Their eyes met, and though neither said a word, something invisible passed between them. A spark. A silent thread of understanding, and in that brief moment she realized she might be invisible to everyone else, but not to this woman. The grand table shimmered under soft light, every surface gleaming like a mirror of power. The billionaire sat tall, his posture calculated, every movement rehearsed for a world that expected perfection. Yet beside him, his mother's grace existed in another rhythm, slower, quieter, deeper. She smiled when others did. She nodded when conversation turned her way. But her eyes betrayed the truth. They drifted from one mouth to another, chasing words she could never hear. Each laugh around her was a question she couldn't answer. Each toast, a moment she had to pretend to understand. The waitress noticed. She always noticed. While others admired jewels and wine, she saw hands trembling slightly, lips moving without meaning, loneliness hidden behind politeness. The older woman's smile was kind, but her eyes carried exhaustion, the kind that comes from being surrounded by noise you can't enter. Balancing a tray of empty glasses, the waitress paused for just a breath. Her reflection glinted faintly in the wine bottle, and she caught her own expression, tired, composed, invisible. It startled her. The same look rested on the mother's face. Two worlds, one silence. She wanted to reach out. She wanted to say, "I see you." But she couldn't. Not here. Not with the maître d' watching every move like a hawk. So she did what she always did. She served, smiled, and disappeared. Yet, as she placed another plate before the billionaire's mother, the woman's eyes lifted, meeting hers. It was a brief connection, but in that second it felt as if the entire room faded away. The older woman mouthed a soft, "Thank you." The waitress hesitated. Her instinct urged her to respond in the language she knew, the silent one, the one made for moments exactly like this. But fear tightened her hands into fists. Behind her, the maître d' frowned. His voice sliced the air. "Keep moving!" he hissed. She nodded quickly and turned away. Back in the kitchen doorway, she exhaled. The sound of sizzling pans and clattering dishes filled the silence she carried inside. The chef looked at her curiously. "Everything fine?" "Yes," she said automatically, but nothing was fine. Out in the dining room, the billionaire spoke softly to his mother, but she simply nodded again, her smile patient, her eyes far away. He didn't notice her struggle. No one did, except the waitress. The night moved on, laughter and music filling the air, a symphony of sound that excluded the one person it celebrated. And somewhere between the clinking glasses and the muted piano, the waitress realized something she couldn't ignore. Silence could be heavier than noise. And tonight, it was crushing them both. The restaurant hummed again with sound, laughter, forks, music. Yet to her it all seemed distant, muted, like watching life from behind glass. The waitress moved mechanically through the aisles, serving, clearing, smiling. Her body knew the motions, but her mind was far away, drawn again and again to the woman at the center table. The billionaire's mother sat with perfect posture, her elegance untouchable, but her eyes betrayed a constant searching. She watched the lips of her son as he spoke, smiled when others laughed, nodded when she was expected to. Yet her eyes carried that subtle ache of someone who lived outside the room she was in. The waitress recognized it instantly, the invisible isolation of someone who existed but wasn't heard. It was a kind of loneliness that didn't announce itself. It just sat quietly in the soul, waiting to be noticed. Balancing a tray of wine glasses, she moved closer to their table. Her steps slowed unconsciously, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. As she leaned in to replace a half-empty glass, the mother looked up. Their eyes met. It wasn't like before. This time it held weight. A flicker of something passed between them, curiosity, recognition, maybe even gratitude. The waitress's pulse raced, her fingers twitched at her side, curling slightly as if remembering old motions. She could feel the memory of her hands shaping words, silent words she hadn't dared to use in public. Her breath caught, her heart pounded so loud it felt like the whole room could hear it. From the corner of her eye, she saw the maitre d' watching her, his expression tight. The chef peeked again through the kitchen window, trying to sense what had changed. Even the nearby guests paused mid-conversation, drawn by a tension they couldn't explain. The mother's gaze didn't waver. It was gentle but insistent, as though asking a question without sound. The waitress swallowed hard. Her hands trembled. Every part of her training screamed to stay silent, to fade back into the background. But another voice, quieter, older, deeper, whispered inside her, "Speak, just this once." She clenched her fists, holding herself back. The maitre d' began to move toward her, but the billionaire raised one hand subtly, stopping him without even looking. His attention stayed on his mother, though confusion crept into his eyes as he noticed her fixed gaze on the waitress. The waitress stepped back, pulse roaring in her ears, her face flushed with fear and longing. The mother smiled, a small, knowing smile, as though she already understood the battle raging inside the girl's heart. And as the waitress turned away, one thought pulsed through her mind, clear and undeniable. If she didn't break her silence tonight, she never would. The weight of the evening pressed heavier with every passing second. The waitress could barely focus on the routine, the orders, the refills, the polite, "Yes, sir." Her hands shook when she reached for glasses. Her breath came shallow, uneven. The silence between her and the billionaire's mother had become unbearable. She had tried to ignore it. She had tried to be the shadow she was trained to be. But every time she looked up, the older woman's eyes were waiting, kind, searching, expectant. The room glowed with the golden warmth of chandeliers, but her skin felt cold. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the music. The maitre d' moved nervously by the door, his smile stretched tight. The billionaire sat like a statue, his control immaculate, but the air around his mother shimmered differently, alive, hopeful, trembling. Balancing a tray with a half-empty glass, the waitress approached their table again. She tried to steady her steps, to hide the storm inside her. The mother smiled faintly. Her lips moved in a soft, "Thank you." Something inside the waitress cracked. The loneliness in that silent thank you reached somewhere deep, the same place she had hidden her own silence for years. Her pulse raced, her chest burned, her hands itched to move, and then before her fear could stop her, she did it. Her right hand lifted, slow and deliberate. Her fingers shaped a single, unmistakable sign. Hello. It was simple, gentle, but it sliced through the air like thunder. The billionaire's mother froze, her eyes widened, mouth parting in disbelief. For a long heartbeat she didn't move. Then, with trembling hands, she raised her own and answered. The same gesture, returned like a prayer. The world stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware paused mid-air. Even the pianist's fingers slipped from the keys. Every gaze in the room turned toward them. The billionaire's mother, radiant for the first time that evening, and the trembling waitress who had dared to speak without sound. Tears welled in the older woman's eyes. Her lips moved, slowly forming words she couldn't hear. "Thank you." The waitress's throat tightened. She wanted to say more. Her fingers began to move again, shaky but sure. "You're welcome." The billionaire turned sharply, his expression unreadable. His mother's joy washed over him like light breaking through fog, but he said nothing. The maitre d' froze, torn between protocol and disbelief. The chef leaned out of the kitchen window, silencing his brigade with a gesture. Even the guests stopped breathing. It was as if the entire restaurant had forgotten what sound was, all waiting for what came next. If this moment gave you chills, stay with me. What happens next will surprise you even more. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it. The silence that followed felt alive. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a living thing, stretching, breathing, filling every inch of the restaurant with something holy and fragile. The billionaire's mother sat still, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. Then slowly she smiled. Not the polite smile she had worn all evening, but a real one, full of light and disbelief. Her lips parted, trembling with joy. Her hands moved again, graceful, fluent. "You know sign language?" The waitress nodded slightly, tears blurring her vision. Her voice would have ruined the moment. So she simply raised her hands again, answering in the same silent beauty. A little. Enough to say hello. Gasps broke out among the guests. A woman covered her mouth. A man muttered, "She can sign." Another whispered, "I've never seen his mother so happy." But most of them just stared, watching the impossible unfold between two people who had never spoken. The maitre d' hovered by the door, frozen between fear and awe. He knew this wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't on the script. The billionaire's guests weren't meant to interact with staff, but even he couldn't bring himself to interrupt. Something sacred was happening. The chef leaned half out of the kitchen window, towel over his shoulder, eyes locked on the scene. His team had gone completely still. The clatter of dishes stopped, the sizzle of pans fading into quiet. At the center of it all, the billionaire sat motionless. His dark eyes flicked between his mother and the waitress. Confusion shadowed his face, then something deeper, something like wonder, but buried beneath pride. The mother lifted her trembling hands again, shaping another phrase with care. "Thank you." The waitress's heart clenched. She signed back softly, "You're welcome." And that was it. Just two gestures, yet they carried the weight of years. The billionaire's mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached forward instinctively, as if to touch the waitress's hand, but stopped herself, remembering where she was. Still, the emotion on her face said enough. For the first time that night, the billionaire looked small, like a man realizing the world held something he could neither buy nor control. If you felt that, don't look away. What happens next will move you even more. The waitress took a shaky breath. Around her, murmurs grew, quiet, reverent. The maitre d' whispered to a waiter, "Do we stop this?" The waiter shook his head. "You can't stop something like that." The pianist, who hadn't played since the first gesture, finally lifted his fingers again, but instead of the planned waltz, he began to play something softer, something fragile. The room exhaled together, united in silence and sound. And in that silence, one truth settled deep. Sometimes the loudest moments are the ones without a single word. The billionaire's mother sat motionless for a long time, her eyes locked on the waitress. Around her, the restaurant had forgotten how to breathe. Even the air seemed to tremble. Then, with slow, trembling grace, the older woman lifted her hands again. Her fingers moved carefully, deliberately. "Thank you." The waitress's breath hitched. Her vision blurred, and her throat tightened so much it hurt. She hesitated, afraid to respond, afraid of what the room might think. But something stronger than fear guided her. She raised her hands, too, her movements soft and respectful. "You're welcome." A murmur spread through the restaurant. A man whispered, "She's talking to her." Another said, "I didn't know anyone here could sign." Someone else, softer, "Look at her face. She's never smiled like that." The billionaire sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Pride warred with something else. Guilt, maybe, or awe. His mother turned to him, her smile wide and pure, eyes glistening with tears. She signed something quickly, her fingers flying. He didn't understand, and it showed. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes dropped. For the first time that evening, he looked human. The waitress wanted to step back, to disappear into safety. But when the older woman's hand reached across the table, instinct took over. Their fingers met. It was only for a second, but it felt eternal. The contact was feather-light, yet heavy with meaning. An entire lifetime of silence met with understanding. Tears filled the waitress's eyes. The older woman's hands trembled, her lips curving into a whisper the waitress could almost read. "I see you." The room gasped softly, 100 tiny reactions blending into one shared emotion. Even the maitre d', normally stone-faced, blinked hard and looked away. One guest murmured, "That's real gratitude." Another answered, "That's love." The chef leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unexpectedly gentle. "Let them be," he muttered to no one in particular. The billionaire's voice broke the silence at last, deep, low, conflicted. "Mother." She looked up at him with eyes full of pride and something else, a quiet reproach softened by love. Her hands moved again. He didn't understand the words, but the message was clear. She wasn't thanking him, she was thanking her. The waitress stepped back finally, her chest heavy, her heart wild. She had never felt so exposed, so alive. The line between guest and servant had vanished completely. If you're still watching, breathe for a moment. What happens next will leave you speechless. The billionaire's gaze followed the waitress as she turned to leave. His voice, rough and low, stopped her mid-step. "You." She froze, and the entire restaurant turned to see what he would say next. The word hung in the air. "You." One syllable, heavy as thunder. The waitress froze mid-step, her tray pressed to her chest, her heart hammering in her ears. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the sound of the city beyond its doors, fading to nothing. The billionaire stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the marble floor. Even that small noise sounded deafening in the silence. His tailored suit caught the chandelier's glow, his every movement deliberate, precise. Yet beneath that composure was something unfamiliar. His eyes fixed on her, sharp, assessing. But beneath the steel there was confusion, maybe even awe. He took a step forward. The maitre d' stiffened by the door, uncertain whether to intervene. A few guests whispered nervously. The chef, still leaning from the kitchen hatch, folded his arms tighter, unwilling to miss a moment. The billionaire's mother watched quietly, her expression soft, calm, almost proud. Her fingers moved in tiny, invisible patterns on her lap, fragments of words her son couldn't understand. He stopped a few feet from the waitress. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear back into the safety of routine, but she couldn't move. His gaze pinned her to the floor. "You spoke to her," he said finally, his voice low, rough, controlled. The waitress swallowed hard. Her voice trembled. "Yes, sir. I know a little sign language." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some in awe, others in judgment. The billionaire's eyes flicked briefly toward the onlookers, then back to her. "How?" She hesitated. I learned on my own, for someone I once knew. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For someone you knew, he repeated quietly, as though tasting the words. His tone carried no sarcasm, no arrogance, only thought. His mother's hands began to move again, signing something rapidly. His eyes darted to her, frustration flickering when he realized he couldn't follow. The waitress stepped forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. She said, "She's grateful. You make her proud." The billionaire froze. His lips parted just slightly, his breath catching in disbelief. She said that? Yes. He turned to his mother again. Her smile was radiant, her eyes glistening with warmth he hadn't seen in years. For a brief moment, his composure cracked. The mask of power slipped, replaced by something raw, a son realizing how much he'd missed. The pianist began to play again, soft and slow. The restaurant exhaled together. The billionaire blinked, inhaled deeply, then spoke, his voice quieter, almost human. "Thank you," he said. The waitress's breath hitched. She hadn't expected that. Gasps again. A billionaire thanking a waitress? Impossible. Yet there it was. Truth stripped of power. "If you felt this shift, don't blink. The next moment will change everything." His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, and in that touch, he finally understood what silence could say. The billionaire's thank you lingered in the air like perfume, delicate, unexpected, impossible to ignore. The restaurant was frozen between disbelief and awe. No one dared move. The only sound was the faint, shaky breath of the waitress who stood trembling in the center of the room. For years, she had lived invisible, passing unnoticed between tables. Now all eyes were on her, but not all gazes were kind. At one table near the back, a woman leaned toward her companion, whispering sharply, "This is unacceptable." Another, softer voice answered, "Maybe it's the first real thing that's ever happened in this place." The maitre d' shifted nervously by the door, his professional mask cracking. "Sir," he whispered to the billionaire, "should we escort her away?" His tone carried fear, not of the girl, but of breaking decorum. The billionaire didn't answer. His mother's hand was still wrapped around his. The gesture, small, simple, silenced everyone more effectively than any command could. The waitress could feel their judgment like heat on her skin. She wanted to shrink, to apologize, but when she looked at the older woman's face, the courage to stay rooted returned. The mother's smile was full of gratitude, her fingers twitching slightly, forming another sign. The waitress responded before she could stop herself, quiet but confident. It was an honor. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd again. Some of the guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, moved despite themselves. The billionaire's gaze flicked around the room, the polished elites shifting in their seats, uncertain whether to applaud or sneer. For the first time in his life, he saw them clearly. He saw their masks, their fragility, their dependence on judgment to feel important. His eyes softened as he turned back to the waitress. "You've done something I couldn't," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the stillness. "You made her feel understood." The words weren't rehearsed. They didn't sound like the language of men who owned cities. They sounded human. The chef watched from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "About time someone said something real in this place," he muttered. His staff nodded silently. The waitress tried to speak, but her voice broke before any words came. So she did what came naturally. She signed, slowly, carefully, "She loves you." The billionaire's expression faltered. His mother nodded through tears. For the first time, the man who commanded everything stood powerless in front of two women who asked for nothing. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. If you're still watching, take a deep breath. You've never seen what comes next. The maitre d' straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and whispered to a colleague, "Whatever happens now, the world outside this restaurant won't believe it." And in that instant, everyone understood. This night had already become legend. The billionaire remained standing, his eyes unfocused, his expression unreadable. Around him, the restaurant was still silent, not out of obedience this time, but reverence. The air felt charged, alive with the echo of something greater than wealth or class. The waitress stood motionless. Her tray was clutched to her chest, her knuckles white. She had no idea what would come next. Applause, dismissal, humiliation, all were possible, all were deserved, maybe, but none came. Instead, the billionaire exhaled slowly, his composure finally cracking. His gaze drifted to his mother. She was still smiling, her hands trembling as they hovered in midair, shaping invisible words he couldn't understand. For the first time, he looked at her differently, not as a duty, not as a burden to protect, but as a person he had never truly known. The waitress took a small step back, ready to retreat into her world of shadows again. But then, the billionaire's voice stopped her. Wait. His tone wasn't harsh. It wasn't commanding. It was quiet, human. She turned slowly, heart pounding, unsure if she had just crossed a line she could never return from. He took a breath, then said the words no one in that room could have predicted. Thank you. The words echoed louder than any applause could have. Guests blinked, stunned. The maitre d' froze, his mouth slightly open. The chef leaned against the kitchen door, his hand gripping the frame as if to steady himself. Sir? The maitre d' managed uncertain. The billionaire ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on the waitress. You gave her something I never could, he said softly. You reminded me that silence doesn't mean absence. It means we weren't listening. The waitress's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak. The mother signed again, her movements fluid, full of meaning. The waitress hesitated, then translated quietly, her voice trembling. She says, she's proud of you. The billionaire blinked. His lips parted slightly as his eyes glistened, not with weakness, but realization. He looked back at his mother, then at the waitress, as though seeing both for the first time. His voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe pride is something we earn, not buy. A guest at the far table began to clap softly. Another joined. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was filled with the soft, echoing rhythm of applause. Hesitant at first, then warm, then overwhelming. The waitress's eyes filled with tears. She didn't bow. She couldn't. She simply nodded once, her hands trembling as she held the tray close. If you've stayed until now, you're part of something special. But wait, the final moment will stay with you forever. The billionaire turned to his mother again, and this time he didn't speak. He raised his hand, clumsy, uncertain, and shaped a single sign. Thank you. His mother gasped softly. Then she smiled, radiant, her eyes glistening with pride. The applause faded slowly, like waves receding after a storm. What remained was something rarer. Stillness, the kind that stays after something true has happened. The waitress stood frozen in that stillness, her chest tight, her hands trembling at her sides, her mind swirled with disbelief. Had she really spoken, not with her voice, but with her hands, in front of them all? Had she really changed something? Around her the staff began to move again, cautiously, as if waking from a dream. The maitre d' blinked several times, struggling to regain control of the evening, his voice uncertain as he whispered to no one in particular, "Back to service, please." But the spell wouldn't break. The billionaire remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of his mother's chair. His usual command, the cold weight of his authority, seemed to have vanished. In its place was something gentler, unspoken, humility. His mother's smile lingered as she reached for his hand. She squeezed it gently, her eyes still wet. He looked at her and, for once, didn't look away. The waitress took a step back, ready to retreat, but her feet refused to move. She could feel every gaze on her, yet none of it mattered anymore. What had happened wasn't about wealth or status, it was about recognition. Two souls meeting across a lifetime of silence. The billionaire looked toward her once more. "You reminded me," he said softly, "that connection doesn't need permission." The words weren't meant for the room. They were for her. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them away, managing a shaky smile. "I'm glad I could help, sir." "You did more than that," he said quietly. "You changed something in me." Behind him guests whispered, but this time not with disdain. There was something softer in their voices now. Reflection, respect. A woman near the bar dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A young man filmed quietly on his phone, knowing he'd just captured something unforgettable. The billionaire turned to his mother. She signed again, her fingers flowing with calm certainty. The waitress watched, understanding the simple message even from across the room. Be kind, always. The billionaire nodded slowly. "I'll try." The maitre d' approached the waitress, hesitant. "You should take a break," he murmured, unsure how to handle her now, as staff or as something else entirely. She smiled faintly. "I'm fine." Then she looked one last time toward the table. The mother met her gaze and lifted her hand, forming one small word in the air. Hope. The waitress smiled through her tears and answered silently, "Always. If you're still watching, don't go yet. What comes next will touch your heart forever." The billionaire guided his mother to her feet. Together, they walked toward the exit, the room parting quietly as they passed. And for the first time, the waitress realized silence could change everything. Morning light spilled softly through her window, painting thin golden lines across the worn walls of her tiny apartment. The waitress sat at the edge of her bed, still wearing the quiet disbelief of the night before. Her uniform hung neatly on a chair, the faint scent of wine and perfume lingering like ghosts from another world. She rubbed her hands together slowly, tracing the faint tremble that remained. It felt like energy, not from exhaustion, but from something alive inside her, something new. She thought of the restaurant, the chandeliers, the marble, the stairs. She thought of his mother's smile, that radiant, wordless joy, and of the billionaire himself, stripped of power, standing silent and human. The memory was clear, yet unreal, like a dream too beautiful to belong to her. She had gone home without fanfare. No one followed, no one clapped, but the silence that accompanied her walk through the city felt different now. Not empty, but full. Full of meaning, full of memory, full of something the world rarely gives. Acknowledgement. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from an unknown number. "She wanted you to know she hasn't stopped smiling since last night." No signature. She didn't need one. She knew who it was from. A tear rolled down her cheek before she even realized it. She typed back slowly, her fingers trembling. "Please tell her. She reminded me what it means to be seen." She set the phone down, exhaling shakily, and stood. The city outside was waking, car horns, laughter, noise. But she didn't rush to drown in it, not yet. She stood in front of her small mirror, the same one she'd used for years to practice sign language. Her reflection older now, wiser. She raised her hands, slowly, deliberately, the same way she had at the restaurant. "Hello." Her reflection answered, the gesture mirrored perfectly. For the first time, it didn't feel like practice. It felt like peace. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking glass towers, the billionaire sat at a breakfast table with his mother. The usual reports and phone calls were gone. Instead, a notepad sat open, full of clumsy sketches, shapes of hands, symbols, letters. She guided him patiently, laughing when he fumbled. He smiled too. He wasn't learning to command. He was learning to listen. Money had built walls around his life, but one simple gesture had broken them down. Back in her apartment, the waitress smiled faintly, her heart calm for the first time in years. The world would forget her name. The restaurant would move on. But somewhere, someone had seen her, and that was enough. She lifted her hands again and signed one last word to her reflection. Hope. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what it made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the smallest gesture can echo louder than any word and change a life forever. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away, share it. Because somewhere, someone needs to be reminded that kindness still speaks louder than words. Subscribe for more stories like this, and never forget, even silence can change everything.